All right, everyone. So, more news today. The CDC warns of increased risk of dengue infections in the US. Now, I'm not going to talk about the specific numbers. Apparently, they're saying that there's been an increase in dengue throughout the Western Hemisphere, which is believable. Dengue is endemic through most of the Western Hemisphere. But I do want to talk about the quote unquote increased risk. And I do believe that there is an increased risk, but I think this article goes off on the wrong direction to try and explain it. And you can probably already guess what their explanation is, which is, well, things are hotter, so now we have more mosquitoes, which doesn't really make any sense when you actually think about it. So I am familiar with dengue. I used to live in the Caribbean for a couple years in Puerto Rico, and dengue was endemic there. There would be annual outbreaks of dengue, usually in San Juan. But there was also lots of other mosquito-borne illnesses. There was Zika when that was a thing. Chikungunya was a thing for a while that people were talking about, West Nile, things like that. And I knew many people that had gotten these diseases. They're not enjoyable by any stretch of the imagination. Dengue in particular is not particularly interesting the first time you get it. It is a hemorrhagic fever. But generally, the first time you get it, people have mild symptoms. And the article goes on about the symptoms here. Eye pain, muscle pain, bone pain, headache, nausea, vomiting. Fever is a big one. But this belongs to a family of viruses called I believe it's the flavivirids. And this group of viruses, why they're dangerous is it's the third time you get the disease. They can weaponize your own antibodies against you. So then you begin bleeding underneath the skin, and you can go into shock and things like that. And people in the area were very familiar with these diseases. So this article goes on about that there's increased numbers, there's probably increased risk. It's probably because it's hotter, which is just the laziest explanation. And that's what kills me with a lot of this quote-unquote scientific writing that comes out. People take the laziest route to explain things. There has been an increase in mosquito-borne illnesses. There have been an increase in what types of diseases we're seeing, the number of mosquitoes that we're seeing in an area. And this is a multi-pronged issue, and most of it can be laid at the feet of failures of local and state governments. Vector control programs are chronically underfunded in the United States. It wasn't always like this. Once upon a time, there was very serious work being done for vector control of mosquito-borne illnesses. Most people in the US probably don't realize this, but historically, vast swaths of the US were basically uninhabitable because of how severe mosquito infestations were and all of the diseases carried by those mosquitoes. Malaria used to be endemic in the United States. Dengue, obviously, and it still shows up in Florida pretty frequently, and in Puerto Rico. Yellow fever was a huge problem. Basically, if you lived anywhere along the Gulf Coast, anywhere in a floodplain for a river or any swampy area, you were at severe risk of any of these mosquito-borne diseases. Philadelphia had a major yellow fever epidemic back in the 1790s. In the mid-1800s, Memphis was basically wiped out because of a yellow fever epidemic, and the city was depopulated. This has been a recurring theme throughout U.S. history. And so in the 40s and 50s, when pesticides became cheap and widespread, there was concerted effort to destroy the mosquito populations in the United States. And this is where we wiped out malaria, we wiped out yellow fever, and it was the spraying of DDT, the painting of pesticides on walls inside homes, and all this that not only wiped out the mosquitoes, it wiped out large tick populations, it wiped out bed bug populations, and people could live much more comfortable insect disease-free lives. So remember that when people go on and on about how we need to get rid of pesticides and all this. You don't want to go back to ye olden days of severe insect-borne disease. Anyway, in the last couple of decades, people have kind of forgotten about this, and cities and states have really underfunded or cut funding to, sometimes doing away with, vector-borne disease control programs. So even when I was younger, the mosquito truck would come around all the time in the summer, usually once a week, to spray for mosquitoes. I haven't seen a mosquito truck in years and years and years. And maybe you remember these. Maybe these are still in your area. These big trucks with massive aerosol sprayers on top that would buzz, literally make this horrible buzzing sound, and go around spraying for mosquitoes in order to control them. But we've really cut back on that. Occasionally they'll increase funding for this, like when the Zika outbreak occurred. Everyone was very concerned about mosquitoes and they started putting more money towards this. But then once that kind of dips out of the news cycle, cities and states just cut funding to these programs again. And it's this reactive cycle of, well, it's not an issue now, so we can save money by just not caring about this. And then that leads to massive outbreaks of mosquitoes down the line. And then a new disease shows up and they have to rebuild all this infrastructure. And this is an issue that the National Institutes of Health knows about, but it's hard to get people to do preventative measures for issues that they don't know about in the future. This is always a problem. Other issues with this that we haven't had to think about in a while: crumbling infrastructure. States, cities, the federal government not investing in rebuilding infrastructure. And you think, well, why is this an issue? Again, large parts of the United States, large cities in the US, are built on former swampland. This is, obviously Washington, D.C. is famous for the Potomac River. That's all swamp. The entire Gulf Coast, Houston sits on a swamp. Louisiana, the whole state is a swamp. Everything's built on a swamp. Large parts of Florida, large parts of Virginia, large parts of Maryland, large parts of the Carolinas. Ohio used to be a swamp. This is all swampland that has been drained through the building of large infrastructure to move water and the destruction of insect populations that would otherwise spread disease. This infrastructure is crumbling. There hasn't been serious investment in infrastructure probably for 40 or 50 years, and eventually all of these drainage systems give way. You get local flooding again, perpetual flooding, where you just breed mosquito populations, and these populations will spread this disease. On top of that, things that used to be common knowledge when there were mosquito control campaigns in the Caribbean, and you don't really hear about it or see it in the United States, is litter control campaigns. And this is a huge issue for mosquito control in cities, where you don't necessarily have swampland extant at this point, but you do have issues with drainage and water collection. Litter holds a lot of water after a rain. So anywhere where you have piles of litter, where you have big gulp cups and all of this nonsense, it collects water and it keeps that water there long enough for mosquitoes to breed in it. And you might see this around your own neighborhoods. After a rain, there's just large swampy areas where there's garbage buildup. And cities just don't clean up garbage like they used to. Even in the suburbs, you see large trash dumping areas where the city should be cleaning this up. The locals shouldn't be dumping trash there, but they still do, and this becomes a huge mosquito breeding ground. And it's just, these are hard to deal with issues. These are issues that require effort and money, and people don't want to talk about it, so instead they just say, well, it's just because things are getting warmer, the mosquitoes must be spreading. The mosquitoes have always been there. No one thinks, well, Puerto Rico is having this epidemic because mosquitoes showed up. Mosquitoes have always been there. When I was there, you couldn't go outside without being eaten alive. You couldn't sit inside without being eaten alive. They would come in and find you. Florida has always had dengue problems. It's always had mosquito problems. Mosquitoes going up into the north have always been an issue. If you want to see horrible mosquitoes, go to Minnesota, go to Maine. The mosquitoes are huge. I was in Wisconsin. One of the jokes is the mosquito is the state bird. Like, this has always been an issue. Yes, there might be more mosquitoes, but it's not just because it's warm. It's because there's been fundamental failures in mosquito control efforts. So that's what I want to talk about. I wanted to bring this to people's attention. If you are sick of mosquitoes in your area, bring it up with your city council or your municipal board or whoever controls your area, and make sure that money is going into mosquito control. Clean up your own litter in your neighborhoods. Start these campaigns to clean stuff up, to force cities to rebuild flood and drainage infrastructure, and you can deal with this in your own area. It requires, a little proactivity on everyone's part, but it can be dealt with. Thanks so much.